Welcome back, everybody, to this week's episode of Lindsey Byrd and Writing is Hard. This week, we're looking at writing a fantasy world that's been inspired by the Renaissance, how the arts and sciences can be taken to a fantasy realm, and how writing can be both like gardening and sculpting. We also talk about joining writing and critique groups, proper etiquette within the beta reading process, including how to manage critical feedback, and what it's like to bring a work to your agent and eventual publication. I hope you enjoy. Today's author interview is with Andrea Max. Andrea has an MSW from New York University and is a high school English teacher. She lives with her husband and son in New Jersey, where she apparently starts a lot of projects that she'll never finish. But one work she absolutely has finished is her 2025 debut novel, which is out on the 13th of May, 2025. Her book, The Art of Exile, is described as Legend-born meets the Da Vinci Code. And its back of book blurb reads, Ada Castle infiltrates a secret school for the descendants of exiled Renaissance masters to steal their long-lost arts and sciences. She must suppress her growing feelings for her mentor that she's lying to while faking a relationship with her nemesis, who is as handsome as he is deadly, in order to prevent theft from reigniting a centuries-old inquisition. So, just to get us started, what inspired you to write this story?
Mostly the fact that I wanted to write something and I took all of the things I most enjoyed in a story and put it into one thing. So that's really the simple answer. But I'd say there were two main questions that really sparked the premise of the story. And the first one was the idea of what a utopia would look like if it really was a utopia and didn't devolve into a dystopia, and what it would take, as most dystopian stories that we read, we often find they started off as an attempt to create a utopia. So I wanted to explore that idea of, what if it's not a dystopia? What does that look like? And that's where a lot of some like the foundational ideas of the Maker Society came from, this concept of a more perfect version of our society. Um, and then another big question, kind of separate from that, that led to the inspiration was this idea of man being created in the image of the divine, and like man having a responsibility to complete the creation of the world. If that's a belief, what does that very literally look like? And I kind of got started thinking, like, what are all the skills that would be needed to do the work of the creator of the universe? And in trying to identify those skills, that is where the guilds of Genesis came from. It's also where the idea of a sire, which is, I guess, a magical ability in the society, someone who can create something from nothing. The idea for that power came from, well, this is the one thing we can't do if we're, you know, doing the work of God. If we can't create something from nothing, we need to add that into the mix. So, exploring that general concept sparked a lot of what eventually became the Maker Society.
There's so much to unpack there. So let's see where we can start. So was this the first book that you ever tried writing, or had you been writing beforehand?
I definitely wrote my whole life, but this is the only book I wrote more than a full chapter of. Yeah.
Why do you think you finished this book now in this moment versus other things you'd written previously?
Well, first of all, I'll say I've been working on this for, at this point, it's probably 6 years. So it wasn't like it happened quickly. But really, I think I always viewed author as part of my identity, like just in an arrogant way of like, of course I'm gonna write something. And one day I was like watching a YouTube video. I think it was like a specifically author tube video, and the girl said, if you don't sit down and write the book, it'll never get written. And I was like, This is something I've been saying I'm going to do my whole life. I have to do it. Like it's when, if not now, when? And those questions I'd been mentioning had been things I'd been stewing on. So I was like, maybe this is the one. Maybe this is the one that could go all the way. Um, and yeah, I have started many art projects I haven't finished, as mentioned. That's definitely me. But I wanted this to happen, and so it did.
So on the back of book blurb, it's talking about Renaissance masters, and the fantasy element is a little bit subdued. It's not until we started talking that it became clear just how important that part really was. Why did you decide to use the Renaissance masters as a hook, and then why also add the fantasy world element inside of it?
Well, first of all, I'll say, as much as I stated it that way, it really isn't technically fantasy. The whole book is framed as science. And all of the forms of magic that exist are, in most cases, like genetic abilities. There's a lot of concept. In fact, I'll back up a little. That's pretty central to the premise. It takes a lot of mythological ideas and magical ideas from our history and claims that no, these were scientific experiments of this group of people. And what we know of now, like they've devolved into myths and legends because the history of them has been lost, but they were real, they were scientific experiments. In one of the early scenes, they're at the cloisters looking at the unicorn tapestries, and it's discussed how this was maybe like a military invention of, and but since we don't know their history, since that was taken away, we've formed it to be magic in our mind. I didn't say that so clearly, but I think you get the idea. And so uh, I definitely leaned more into the fantasy for commercial reasons. I knew who my audience was. I knew like the kind of book I wanted to write, and I knew that fantasy is generally preferred over sci-fi for a YA audience. So I just leaned into making it feel more fantasy. But the Renaissance inspiration, I have a very scattered writing process, so all these questions are going to be a little hard to answer, but because it just evolved in layers over time. But pretty much everything in the book came because I was interested in something, and so I wrote about something I was interested in. Even the opening scene, which takes place at the Accademia Museum in Florence, uh, and my character is looking at the David statue, Michelangelo's statue. That's like basically because I had a moment like that when I was there and I was reflecting on my experience. And since I was passionate about this kind of concept of the Renaissance man and the Renaissance master, things devolved from there. It's very much arts and sciences as the Renaissance values were. So that kind of magic of the arts and sciences taken into a fantastical realm. Did that answer the question?
It does. And I think it really brings up a really interesting dichotomy because there's this old adage where as soon as you if something happens and you don't understand how it works, it's magic. But as soon as you learn how it works, now it's science.
Mhm.
And so science fiction and fantasy, they're very closely related. It all depends how much you start actually explaining it, how much you can really get into it. I mean, one thing that while you were talking that I'm thinking about is alchemy, and how there's all sorts of magical stories. Full Metal Alchemist is a big one where you see a lot of, the fantasy magic, but that's also still rooted in the science of it's coming from this, it's coming from that. The idea of you're making something that's going to, make you live forever, make you be able to turn something from lead to gold, all of that is magic. But it's also rooted in a scientific element. And so I think it makes perfect sense that you're having a fantasy element, but it's also science and you're also explaining it in a more scientific way. And I think that's pretty logical to me personally.
Yeah, and there's definitely alchemy. The alchemists are one of the maker guilds. So I love that general aesthetic of the magical elements of science. And then the book takes it into a more modern realm, kind of taking more advanced technologies of our time and like bringing those into fantastical elements. I think one of the parts of the book that really encapsulates the aesthetic of this kind of modern and historical is the sport they have, which is hover jousting. So it's like jousting tournaments, but they're on hoverboards. And it's a lot of that, right? There's this kind of sciencey futuristic element, but it's being presented in a more fantasy tropey way.
I'm sorry, I had a moment while you're describing it, like literally in my head going, like imagining people on the hoverboards charging at each other. And I was like, well, how do they keep their balance? Because I feel like you'd be far less balanced on a hoverboard than a horse, personally. Because on a horse, you can like grab on with your knees and like you're not supposed to really hold on like that. But like if you had to, you had a little bit of support. What do you do on a hoverboard? That's just your feet. Like that's like getting knocked off a surfboard almost.
Yeah, that was really fun to write. My character, who obviously comes from the regular world and is put into this society, she has a lot of experience snowboarding, so that helps her out with hoverboarding.
Were there other real world things that you use to help inform your more fantasy things in your book?
I mean, definitely. It's very much the book brings together the modern world and like the Renaissance history and other history and mythology as well. Um, there's a lot of New York City elements, which is, I mean, I'm technically in New Jersey, but I'm a New York City person. And people think because it's a fantasy book, they'll think some of these things are fictional and they're totally real, right? Like there's a scene at the old City Hall subway station, which is underground. It's an abandoned subway station that exists in New York City. And people think I made it up. It's no, it's there, it's real. The train that goes from there is maglev technology, right? So I looked a lot at, in trying to create advanced technology, I looked a lot at what was real technology we're working on now and what it might look like in a more advanced form. Um, and just in general, like that was a fun aesthetic I wanted to play with, like bringing in this idea of this hidden society, but they are hidden pretty close to us, so they're going to be influenced from us in many ways. And there are some people coming in from our society at different times in history, influencing them.
Why did you choose New York City for your setting?
Well, it's just the setting of where the character is from. So anytime they're in the regular world, besides the opening in Florence, they're in New York, but most of it takes place on an island in the Atlantic. Um, that again, like I wrote based on my own experience, and that is a place I have spent a lot of time living and enjoying. So it went in there. It helps that there's a lot of like art history and museums. There's scenes in the cloisters and the Met, and um, obviously, New York is one of the most amazing cities in the world, so that helps.
There's a lot of inspiration you can get because you have the access to the cloisters and the Met and things like that.
Yeah.
In your story, you're talking about exiled Renaissance masters. Why exiled masters instead of non-exiled masters? And when you say exiled masters, what exactly do you mean?
Great question. That is, I would say the exile element was a kernel from the very, very beginning. Sorry about that. So there's a lot of Jewish world building inspiration in the book. And before I even knew how overtly Jewish the book would be, I wanted to reflect on the experience of a people whose identity is rooted in their exile. Part of that came as an inspiration. I don't know if you've read the Lumatere Chronicles by
I
Melina.
haven't. What's it about?
It's a fantasy series that's excellent, and anyone who's a fan of high fantasy should read it. But I have no idea if she is Jewish. I've never had any indication of that. But when I read the story, the experience of this group of people that was uprooted from their home and trying to maintain an identity in diaspora, it felt so like that's my history. And it really inspired me to want to write a reflection of that. Um, so much of what is going on with Maker Society is not meant to be Jewish coded, but that idea of them existing in exile, they were exiled during an Inquisition. And, I'm part Sephardic. The Sephardic Jewry comes from, Spain and Spanish Inquisition, where um, so I was shocked in working on this book with a lot of people who weren't raised in the Jewish school system, with how surprised they were with some of the history and things that I mentioned about the Spanish Inquisition they literally never learned about. That kind of tapping into that history of how much culture and society we lost in those time periods when people were not allowed to form, to develop their cultures. So that's where the exiled element came from. A lot of the premise in general was just what developed to be fun, but this idea that at that time, we think we have such a clear knowledge of the Renaissance time period since so much amazing things happened and we have so much record of it and so much art of it. Um, but this idea that maybe innovators of that time were doing a whole lot more that the church wasn't okay with. And what like that's that's part of the premise of the story. The science I was mentioning earlier, right? That was all like heretical science that these people were doing and that they were forced to stop, and that they took with them into hiding. So the world had advancements that it lost and they've kept them. And we don't have the knowledge of that history because it was erased by the church. And what could society have looked like if it had evolved further?
There's a little bit of a alternate history woven into this as well.
Yes, definitely. Mhm.
When you're writing a book that has Renaissance elements to it, it conjures a lot of thoughts and ideas from people who are very familiar, or maybe they just have the aesthetic in mind. How do you bring that about on the page, for those readers to either tap into things that they already know, but also subverting those expectations and bringing in that history that was lost or that you'd like to show that alternate history of?
Well, I think the Renaissance works so well because of that. On one hand, it's the aesthetic, which I brought in a lot with even just things like the fashion, the kind of Renaissance styles matched with modern styles and the fun of that contrast. Um, but there's a lot of references to famous Renaissance art, and um, it's a perfect point for the conversation of what history do we know and don't know because it is such a specific point in time that we have so much reference for from such a Christian point of view when there was so much else happening in the world. And I mean, I don't know about globally how they teach history, but I know that in the US, we learn about the Christian version of the Renaissance, right? Um, so choosing, if I'd written about, say, the Spanish Inquisition, right? There isn't the same kind of reference point to make the point because it's all new. If you're learning the history for the first time, there's no epiphany. But if we're pointing at something we have a reference for, I think there's more room for that conversation.
You're not alone in thinking that the Renaissance is primarily taught in a Christian fashion. It's not just a United States thing. My own experience of, working internationally, that's prevalingly, especially in a more Eurocentric lineage. That's really what is thought about. But you're right. There's so much else happening during this time period. There's huge, not just in the art, there's huge advancements in medical work. There's huge advancements in all sorts of different types of sciences. Um, but those are predominantly in other places where they come into conflict, perhaps, with the more Christian way of looking at things. And so it's really interesting how you're looking at, all right, well, what's the other perspective? What's the other way we can start bringing a little bit more attention to this area versus that area? Um,
And I would say
when
it's
you,
extremely subtly, right? It's a teen book without a strong history focus, as much as there's history themes, but it pokes at that. It's like, wait a second, what, you know, it throws it out there.
well, I think that's one of the joys of art, where if somebody's picking up the book and they're like, Wow, I'm really curious about this. Now they can take that inspiration from reading this teen book to go and read about the nonfiction book elsewhere. They can start doing their own research. And so it's one of the joys about, being introduced to anything where art helps spark that inspiration and spark that interest in finding out more of something else they might not have thought of otherwise.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. That was a huge inspiration for me in what I wanted to put into the book. You know, the Da Vinci Code is one of the comps, and I just have such a strong memory of reading that as a teen. And I did go to Jewish school, so I actually, there's a lot of education I missed out on in terms of Christian history, but it sparked so much interest in art for me and made me do research. And one of the biggest compliments I get on my book is when someone tells me, "Oh, like I went and researched the Bonfire of the Vanities because you mentioned," I love that. So.
What was your favorite thing that you researched or became aware of that you put into the book throughout this process?
So as I mentioned, this has been over a very long period of time, and so I've definitely lost some of, the memory of a lot of that research happened in the earlier stages. But two things that immediately come to mind when I think about it is number one, hover jousting. I had to do a lot of, I wanted, the sport evolved a lot in terms of what I originally had it as and what it became. And I did a lot of research into jousting and kind of Renaissance tournaments and things like that to get inspiration. And that was super fun. Um, and like going to the cloisters, right? I grew up spending a lot of time in New York City. And my husband is from Washington Heights. He literally like was raised there. And so the cloisters was a place that it was like it was just there. Um, and going to the museum and like pulling inspiration, finding things I wanted to look in more into more deeply and seeing how it connected to Cloisters was actually added pretty late in the process. And so finding these connections to a book I'd already written was really fun.
So you said you started writing this book about 6 years ago?
I don't remember exactly, but probably because my kid is turning 7. I think I maybe even started pieces of it before I was pregnant with him, so it was probably longer. But I really took it seriously during COVID, and it had been something I'd been working on for a few years before that.
How does your actual process of drafting work? What were you writing it start to finish? Were you doing different chapters in between? How did you actually pull the book together?
I wish I knew what my process was because I'm working on the sequel now, and wow, it is hard. Um, but really, the way it was such a chaotic process, which is why I better develop a better one. I basically wrote scenes that I wanted to write that were fun to me without, like, at the beginning, there was no story even. And structure is something that I'm most passionate about in writing. So a lot had to change to give it a good structure when things started out as completely independent and unconnected scenes. Um, but yeah, in general, like if I'm in the mood to write a vibe between characters, I sit down and write that. If I encounter something that I think is, really this could make an interesting plot point and it connects to my ideas, I do a little research and then sit down and write the scene that kind of blossoms from that and then patchwork it together and do a lot of editing.
What does your editing process look like? Like, do you wait for the entire thing to be finished? Do you go back and edit scenes that you've just written? How do you actually like create the book itself?
I'm very much a layered writer, in that like I have to return to a scene so many times before I get it right, and I'm like dealing with different layers of it each time. I do edit as I write, which isn't recommended, but that's just the way it happens for me. I need to be able to look back at a scene and feel really excited about it to like kind of fuel my ability to keep writing. So I usually have like a few really, really perfect, awesome scenes and then a bunch of messy scenes that are just dialogue and nothing else. Um, and uh I don't even know what the beginning looks like, but the end, I have pretty recently been working on editing book one, is a lot of reading it through from start to finish to make sure the pacing is hitting, and make sure the characterization feels good. Um, so I don't know if that answered the question, but I'm not sure I have a clear answer.
Different for everybody. I definitely can empathize with the writing the cool scenes and then knitting things together afterwards. I definitely have those moments where I personally am just like, I need this scene right now. And then I'm like, all right, there's like a good 7 chapters between this scene and what I wrote previously or where I'm going next. So I do understand that very much. And um, I think I also at the same time, like, really get the need to like have this is the right scene in this particular place and editing it to make sure it's good. I don't know if you feel this way, but I know for me, if I write a scene and I'm not certain about it, I get really frustrated if I've written the rest of the book and then I have to go back and change all of that other stuff because I had to edit something over here. And so it's like if I edit it and it's perfect the first time, the rest of it will be perfect the next time. And I don't have to change the rest of the book over and over and over again. I'm not sure if that's similar or not.
I pretty much accept that I'm gonna have to change things just because I write in such a disorganized way. I was actually, I'm working on the sequel and my agent was like really trying to help me outline things more in advance. And she was saying like, don't like we want to avoid the amount of edits you had to do last time. I was like, that's the process. I'm not sure I know how to write and get it, I think I need those edits to find a lot of the coolest elements I find later. Um, I would also say I'm very much like I think I heard the term like headlights writer, where you like literally just see what the headlights illuminate in front of you, but nothing else about the path. I'll have no idea where something is going. I'll have no idea how I'm going to solve something, and I can't think about trying to figure that out. I have to just kind of keep working, and I know that it will somehow magically figure itself out later. So, I don't know who the quote is. Probably people say it's like George R. R. Martin or Stephen King because they do all the quotes, but I think it was George R. R. Martin who said that he's a gardener where he like plants seeds and he knows they'll grow into something. And I really relate to that. And I also really relate to the metaphor of, and I think this might have also been him, of a sculpture and the idea that instead of creating the story, I'm like finding the story that was hidden in the rock, right? It's there. I just kind of have to find it. So.
I really like that metaphor actually, because I feel like you said, the rock is there. You're just slowly eroding the sides. You're slowly massaging it until it becomes the beautiful bust or whatever it is that you're creating in the end. So I think that's a really nice way of putting it because it's just finding that last little bit to scrape off until it's perfect.
Yeah, exactly.
When you had your draft that you were comfortable with, when did you decide, okay, I'm going to go look for an agent?
Um, I did a lot of work on the book before I queried it. I really wanted to make it perfect. Uh, I don't remember like exactly when along the process, and I did end up needing to do more work. I worked with my agent for a full year before we went on submission, which was partially my time management, but also because we did really make some big changes to it. But I thought it was perfect when I queried it, and I got a lot of feedback. I'm really lucky to have made a lot of great writing connections and found people who were able to, read my drafts and give me feedback. And every step, like once I make one change, I'm like, well, now somebody new needs to read it because I don't know if that screwed something up or if I nailed it and I need new eyes. I probably had a few too many eyes. But I mean, I probably had like 20 readers at least before I felt like this is shelf ready. Let me go find an agent for it.
As somebody who has always struggled to find people to be readers, how did you go about finding 20 people to read your book?
Good question. I will say, I won't say that like all 20 were equally useful, and um, I would have less in the future, but I got really lucky. I would say I'm like trying to think like very literally, where did I meet that person? A few people I met locally. Um, we started like a New Jersey writing group, and they were people I kind of knew, like friends of friends, so they weren't total strangers, and those have become best friends, and they call themselves the book ants. They're amazing. Um, Shout out to you, my book ants. And then I met a bunch of people through Facebook groups. One of my most incredible critique partners, we met in a Facebook group for a podcast, actually. We were fans of a writing podcast. I don't, I think I must have like posted in the Facebook group a million years ago. I'm looking for beta readers, and I got a few really great readers from that, especially one. My sister, people say don't trust your family, but my sister has been one of my most incredible readers because she's somebody I don't mind asking to read over and over again, and she's really passionate about books. So even though she's not a writer, she was amazing. And I would say Discord, which is how we met, right? But I'm not in these groups anymore, but there was a time where I was in a lot of different publishing um, groups, and there's people looking to exchange manuscripts. My advice for writers would be to seek the people who are exchanging manuscripts rather than the people who are just willing to read, because they're much more likely to follow through if you're also giving back to them. And they're learning, like you're gaining something when you're critiquing someone else's manuscript. You're gaining something for your own writing experience, and so they're often more invested. Um, yeah, probably that's the answer.
Without naming names, because I don't want to be targeting any particular groups or people, but what would you say are things to look for as far as a good writing group is concerned versus you enter a group and you're like, you know what, this one might not be for me. Maybe I should back out.
That's great. Hmm. I would say finding people at the same stage as you, which does feel a little bit hypocritical because I, I am very lucky to have got to this point, and now a lot of the people in the groups that I'm in are not at the same stage as me anymore, and they're still really like they're just as useful. So I don't want to say that, oh, you have an agent, so somebody who doesn't have an agent isn't going to be a good critique partner. That's not what I mean. I mean somebody who has the same dedication level. Like, if are they a serious writer? Are they really looking to get publishers? Are they just saying it and making excuses? No offense to people saying it and making excuses. That was me for a long time. That's just part of the process. But it's frustrating if you're really taking it seriously and they're not. And just talent wise, right? I always exchange a chapter first before or three, one or three, but never a whole manuscript at a time because I want to get a sense of their writing and know that I have a respect for their writing level and know they were going to be able to give me feedback. Um, the least helpful are the people who are really complimentary and not giving any criticism and just want to like correct your punctuation, and or the people who are purposefully just looking to criticize because they think that's their job. So they're not looking big picture. They're just like purposely trying to find things to change. And so I think if you find somebody who wants to be doing the same thing as you, they want to be getting their book ready to query, or they want to be getting it ready for submission, they know they know what they're looking for and they're able to provide the same, if that makes sense.
No, it does. And I think that it's what my knee-jerk response would be at the same point, like find somebody who's at a similar moment. It might not be exactly similar where you're agented or not agent. Just like you said, it doesn't have to be that, but a similar wavelength, where you both can be like, all right, we're on the same page, literally or physically, metaphysically, and you can work together at a good balance there. You mentioned what the least helpful feedback would be. If somebody is interested in being a beta reader, and getting involved in doing that, what would you suggest as far as like good practice or good behavior for that beta reading process?
It's a great question. I almost hesitate to answer because I hear answers like this all the time that I disagree with. So I think it really varies from person to person. So, for example, there's a really famous piece of advice. It might be Brandon Sanderson. I'm not sure. I think it is. Who maybe I don't know. I don't know.
He gives a
But
lot of advice. It's entirely possible.
yeah. But basically the idea, it might not have been him. The idea that if they're telling you something is wrong, it's good advice. If they're telling you how to fix it, it's bad advice. And I disagree with that. I have had really excellent, feedback from people with suggestions. And I don't always take them, but sometimes the suggestions are great. And I think that I get like I've mentioned before, I'm really passionate about structure. That's often what I'm giving the most feedback about. And I'll always mention what I think could help. So that's why I a little bit hesitate to say, this is what you should or shouldn't do. I guess the answer would be ask, right? What kind of feedback are they looking for? Do you want suggestions? Do you want me to just tell you if I get bored or confused, or do you want me to say more than that? I'll tell you one of the most helpful types of feedback I was given that I would love if beta readers adapted more, because usually what happens, let me finish the first sentence. The thing that is helpful is if they say where they want to stop reading, where they get bored, and where they lose interest. What tends to happen instead is they ghost you. And my advice to anyone who is a beta reader, and what I always ask for from people reading for me, is if you lose interest, that's perfectly fine. Do not read the whole thing. Don't keep giving me feedback. Just tell me when you lost interest. Because then I know that is a spot that is losing people. And I think also readers burn themselves out because they feel committed to doing a whole book, even if it's really not working for them. I never do that. I'm sorry to everyone I read for. Everybody knows this about me. Even the books I'm enjoying, I usually give up at some point because I just don't have time. But I've given myself that permission to say, like, this isn't working for me. So let me tell you, I'm not going to be the best person to give you feedback. Let me tell you why it's not working for me in case that's useful for you or where I lost interest. I'm moving on. And I want people to do that for me. I don't want them to ghost me, and I don't want them to struggle through reading if they're not enjoying it. I want them to just say, this is the spot. There's a spot where I like Google Docs for feedback because you can kind of see where they're at, even if they don't tell you. And there was a spot where I was losing a few people, and I knew, okay, I love this scene, and I have people who told me this is their favorite scene, but I keep losing people here. There's a problem. And I was able to fix that. So yeah.
One of the things that I think with beta readers as well is how do they give feedback? Because I think it changes. Some people, like you'd mentioned earlier, they're just going to be really blunt and very critical and be like, everything sucks. The book is awful. Off with your head. Um, why would you try to publish this? Or they go completely the other way. It's like, everything's wonderful, fantastic. Great, great, great. Because I feel like there's a social element involved where they don't want to hurt your feelings, or also it's tough love. You just got to get over it. Um, I know this probably changes from author to author, but what would you suggest as good ways for beta readers to either improve that communication, but also authors communicating their boundaries as well when they're having these discussions?
It's a great question, and I'm the worst person to ask because this is what I'm bad at. I know that I am way too blunt with feedback, and it's not because I'm trying to be mean, it's because I'm trying to be fast. Um, right? Like I usually if I'm giving feedback, I have a limited amount of time. I want to get to the point, I want to move on. And if I take too long trying to make a compliment sandwich, I'm going to burn out and not keep reading. So I always warn my like who I'm reading for. I tell them like please like I am not good at giving compliments. I'm thinking them. I'll try to remember to tell you the things that are working, but realistically, I just tend to point out the things that aren't working, and I tend to point it out in as quick language as possible so I can move on, and that's going to feel really negative. And so I try to warn them of that and let them know I'm not the right reader for them if they can't handle that. And I really what I should do is get better, but I'm also like, I'm at kind of at a stage where I'm not giving feedback as often anyways. Um, but I guess, yeah, definitely don't tell them it's good if it's not, right? Or if you don't think you're qualified. I just am shocked, I'm a frequenter of pub tips on Reddit, where a lot of people come to get query feedback. And so often we'll hear things like, all of my readers love the book, but I'm not getting any requests from agents. It's like, why are these people telling you this book is great? It is good. There's good elements, but it needs work. Don't tell someone that a book is great if you don't feel qualified to tell them that. Say, I'm enjoying it. Point out the things that work, but clearly there's a lot of people out there giving too much encouragement, and encouragement is so important. I'm a teacher. I know that this is something I'm not good at with my students either, that I can be too critical instead of encouraging, but you like false um
Expectations.
almost in thinking that it's good, falsely thinking that it's really great when it needs work. It's good to think it has the potential and that you're talented, but thinking it's good as is, writers can't grow from that. They need to like deeply, they should believe that it can always be better because otherwise it's really hard to progress in the industry.
On the other side, for authors who might be receiving critical feedback and then getting very upset about that critical feedback, what are ways that authors could maybe take a moment and not feel as personally attacked when they do get critical feedback?
Another great question. I don't know. I thankfully it's one of my decent traits is I can take critical feedback well. And I am often surprised when I have friends who really, really struggle with it. Because it's kind of foreign to me. In some cases, it's the industry is not for them, right? In some cases, like just the level of the way you're going to have to accept that kind of rejection and that kind of constant critique. If it's too hard for you, it's probably not the industry for you. But I know a lot of really fragile authors who are very successful, so I don't want to like make that blanket statement because clearly, a lot of artists are more fragile and more precious about their work. Um, yeah, I guess I don't really have advice. I probably do if I think about it, but I'm a little bit bitchy, so I'm not the one to ask.
No, I don't think there has to be one set answer. I think it's at the end of the day, everyone needs to take care of their own emotional and mental health. And so if someone's really struggling getting critique, maybe the advice for them might be different from somebody else who might be struggling. I think it's just an important thing to talk about every once in a while to be like, hey, how are you with taking feedback? How are you with giving feedback? If you're going to be involved in the beta writing community, you can't just be the person that tells everyone their work sucks and then get really angry when someone says your work sucks and vice versa. There has to be a balance there where there is going to be an exchange because if you're struggling at the beta stage, just wait till the editing stage, which is so much worse.
Exactly. I think you're right. That really that conversation is one of the most important pieces. And something else I'll point out is like using it as practice to get used to it because right, you are at this stage with me now, we're getting reviews. And I I like I said, I'm tough-skinned. I'm not that person who can't look at my reviews because it makes me spiral. I can look at my reviews. Most of the negative ones don't even bother me. But what absolutely shocked me, like even though everybody says you're going to be surprised and you're going to get all this conflicting ideas and you cannot be properly prepared for what happens. The way that readers, maybe they have terrible reading comprehension or maybe just people comprehend things differently, but the types of criticisms you get on your work that are literally like just completely misunderstanding it or are so opposed. I literally had one review tell me that my book reads like it's middle grade and another like this is silly middle grade with stupid humor and stupid jokes. Another one saying this is too literary and philosophical and and it's just like what? One literally she called it literary fiction and another person called it middle grades so people's experiences are going to be varied and there's no way to control it. There's nothing you can do that's going to create something that is going to be received well by everyone or received the same way by everyone. One of my, interesting reviews was criticizing the book for literally like saying that it is encouraging the very things that it is written to discourage. And it's just like, what twist did you, how did you get there? And you just need to be prepared for that. And it's really, really good practice in these early beta stages of the fact that people aren't going to understand your book the way you want them to. Even some of my really great reviews from friends, I was surprised by one of my really good friends. She wrote a lovely 5-star review, and some of the things she wrote, I was like, that is not correct about the character. Like that is totally not how I perceive the character. That is, people don't understand your book the way you intend, and it's so important to see that from early stages so you can keep that in mind for both how you write it and how it's going to be received long term.
I think that brings up another important part of both the beta process and also the later editing process of when to say this advice is not for me. When like because there has been feedback was like this character is completely wrong. It needs like there and you as the author you go respectfully, I hear you. I'm going to keep it that way. Where do you find the confidence, or where do you draw the line of saying, I'm grateful that you took the time to read the character. This is not my vision. I'm going to keep it the way I want to do it.
Another great question because, right, it feels like an easy thing to answer, but then you see people doing that in a way you wish they wouldn't, right? You're like, wait a second, if everyone's telling you this, there's probably a reason. So you don't want to make that same mistake yourself. The first thing I would say is I don't tell my readers that if I disagree with them, right? That's just it's up to me whether I want to take the advice or not. It's not a conversation I have to have. But for me, it's mostly if I perceive them as not my audience, right? And there's a lot of criticism to be had for my book if you're not my audience. It's written for teen girls in a very teenage relatable voice, right? The humor and the style is really not going to be for everyone. And if someone comes in and is saying this person sounds super immature or whatever it is, something that clearly shows this is not a reader of commercial YA fantasy, it's not like I know I don't have to take it too seriously. I always listen and I always go back and look at it again a few days later with a clearer mind. But it just seems clear to me when they're not my audience that I don't have to take it as seriously as other feedback. Also, I guess if it clashes with something central to what you're trying to do, right? If if there's themes that are important to you and somebody else disagrees with those themes, but you want those things to come through, obviously, if they're pointing out something that maybe is problematic that you didn't realize, you should listen. But often people want different messages in the book than the message you want to give. And if it's clashing with something central, keep the heart of the book. So.
As we're running a little low on time, I wanted to just ask you one final question, which is there anything that we haven't talked about yet that you would like to talk about before the end of our discussion?
No idea. Probably a million things. I'm having a lovely time. So, um, but not anything like particularly strongly, no. You covered some good.
Well, then thank you very much for joining us today, and it was so lovely to have you.
So lovely to be here.
That's it for this week's episode of Lindsey Byrd in Writing is Hard. Andrea Max's book, The Art of Exile, is out on the 13th of May, 2025. Check out the description to find out more about her and her book. If you enjoyed this content, please do like, share, and subscribe so we continue to make you more. Bye for now.